The topic, as you will have seen from the briefing note, is extraordinarily broad. It was, in fact, going to be broader because there was a stage at which we were considering that public and private finance should be brought together. You should never separate them in any case, because how can you? However, for the purposes of this forum, they were separated. But even so, we're trying to cover, as you can see, social investment, international regulatory agencies, the difference between global north and south, systemic and operational issues, and of course, the global financial crisis, the eminence gris behind it all. We're never going to cover all of that here now for our 90 minutes. If we tried to, we'd be here until January, and none of you want to be here until January. So we're going to do it in 90 minutes. Finance and human rights are really in their early stages of their bedfellowness. They don't really understand each other, perhaps, and they certainly haven't been put together for very long. They need each other. Finance needs human rights to justify its existence, I would venture, and human rights need finance in order to bedrock their objectives, to finance their objectives. It's a difficult area to dig into, and this is why I think this particular session, and perhaps particularly private finance, has been carved out and placed in the forum. And hence we have 5 speakers today who we hope are going to take us on a journey from practical, extant examples of the connection between finance and human rights, right through to the bigger, broader, macro picture of where we're going to go and how we might get there. The order that you have on your sheet is the order in which our 5 speakers are going to speak. So I'll just introduce them now and then just say their names as they start their 10-minute presentation henceforth. First of all, we have Aldo Cagliari, who sits to my left, who is the director of the Rethinking Bretton Woods project at the Center of Concern in DC. Next speaker on my right is Drike Havenga, who is the ethics officer in enterprise governance and compliance at Nedbank, the 4th largest bank in South Africa and the most innovative in this area, as you're going to hear. Our next speaker will be Professor Raoul Nieuwenkamp, who sits beyond Drike. He is the chair of the working group of the OECD Investment Committee, as well as a managing director of trade and policy at the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. Our 4th speaker, moving to my left, is Professor Ola Mestad, who is the chair of the Council of Ethics at the Norwegian Pension Fund. I think we can call it the Sovereign Wealth Fund, a generic term. And then finally, to wrap things up in his inimitable style, will be Bennett Freeman, who is the Senior Vice President of Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments. And Bennett sits at the very extreme right. So, no, exactly. He sits at the extreme right, but his mind is his mind is somewhere else. Right. But Aldo's mind is certainly on ball, and Aldo is going to start the ball rolling. Aldo.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My intervention today comes informed by having worked for a few years now with a number of organizations in a consortium that is called a bottom-up approach to writing financial regulation, that is writing with R, not with W. So to make it right, whose objective is to bring human rights accountability to financial regulation and financial reform. And I'm going to zero in on one of the questions that you may have seen on the brief, on 2 of the questions actually, of those that are on the brief for this session. One is the question on whether the financial sector warrants an exceptional treatment because of its systemic impact. The other is about the role of financial regulators. In terms of the first question, does the financial sector require an exceptional treatment as a sector compared with others in account of its systemic impact? The answer for us working in that initiative is a resounding yes. We don't believe we can treat the financial sector just like any other sector. I would say there are 3 reasons why. One of them is the systemic impact and the systemic repercussions of the financial sector. I think we have seen this growing importance of the financial sector. If you look at several indicators, for example, in the last 3 decades, how much the financial sector has grown compared with trade. If you look at financial sector as a percentage of GDP in the world, if you look at financial sector certainly as a percentage of corporate profits, you'll see in all of these measures show the extraordinary impact of the financial sector in a world that is increasingly more interdependent. So we have seen also in the recent financial crisis how the problem starting in one particular country can quickly project and extend itself to become a worldwide problem, and this is a function of the interdependence of the world in which we live. And so we do think it's very important to look at the systemic impacts. If we look at what's going on in Europe today, also the impacts that the European situation is generating in so many parts of the globe, it's also another indicator that I think shows this. But there are other reasons I mentioned. The second reason why you cannot treat it the same as any other sector is usually it's not very visible. It's very harder. It's harder actually than in other sectors for the right holders to demand accountability. I can't think of any other sector where the company to hold accountable is so removed from those affected. For example, you look at a lot of human rights abuses that we have been exploring these past couple of days, mining, oil, agribusinesses. All of those happen with certain type of financing. However, what would come up front is not really the company that is doing the financing. It would be the company that is actually the direct responsible for the abuses in question. And so there are issues there that I think make the financial sector very different in a way. Even in the most clear-cut cases of project finance, sometimes it's very difficult to identify who is the financial, who are the financiers. Even if there are public sector financiers, sometimes it's not so easy to find who those are, who are involved. And yet it is crucial for the activity. The activity would not happen without the support of the financial sector. So it is very unique in that sense. And also it is unique because with its change of behavior, I would say has a lot more leverage, a lot more capacity to change the behavior of other actors to for good reasons, you know, for positive in a positive direction than perhaps other sectors do. So I think it has to be treated very distinctly. The guiding principles give a very clear guidance. They say that business and government has an obligation to address human rights in all areas of business activity, not only those with the most direct or most visible impact on human rights. So I think we have a very good starting point there. But of course, it is not as simple as that. An important issue that is particularly relevant for the systemic impacts I was talking about is that the human rights abuse may have been outside of the control of one particular company. If you think, for example, of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, I'm sure you have heard these numbers many times, that we need 50 million jobs created just to get back to the pre-crisis job level in a situation where 80 million people enter the workforce every year in the world, which means that that number actually understates the extent to which the jobs agenda has been set back by the financial crisis. And we know that there was a convergence of activities by different actors, and there is a financial stability report that in a quite detailed way, a report that came shortly after the crisis, shows all the many things that went wrong. The Basel Agreement regulations providing wrong incentives for banks to pile a certain type of assets in their balance sheets, underwriters loose standards in issuing loans, relaxation of the standards by credit rating agencies to evaluate the quality of those assets, a relaxation of standards by the shadow banking actors that got the assets from the banks, a relaxation of standards among the investors who invested in the shadow banking entities, and so on and so forth. There are all these many aspects, all these many entities involved. So there is all that harm to human rights that came from the crisis. And yet, can we say financial firms which engaged in certain activities that they knew to be very risky to them and the whole economy, but carried them nonetheless? Companies that knew or should have known that the time things went awry, there weren't going to be huge job losses as a consequence. maybe they didn't know the number or the detail, but it was clear that there were going to be these job losses. They knew they were going to be big enough, the companies were big enough, some of them, that the consequences of the failure would not be borne by them, but by public budgets that will come to support them because they could not be let to fail. Can we say those companies should remain unanswerable for harm to human rights that came as a result? I don't think we can. On the other hand, can we say that one particular company which contributed to some specific pieces of that convergence of factors that led to the crisis should be held responsible for human rights abuses, and to what extent? We are talking, in fact, of companies that may have done things that are not even illegal, at least under domestic law. If you listened recently, one of the commissioners of the CFTC in the US, Mr. Val Chilton, I quote, said, "People often complain and ask why nobody went to prison for taking a wrecking ball to the economy." Well, what was didn't break the law? What was that didn't break the law, unquote. So, and he goes on to explain that they are trying to change that, so the things that caused the crisis here and on will be illegal things, but the reality is they were not illegal before. So I think it is a very tough question. It's not easy, and I'm bringing up these considerations to show just how complex it might be to transit the road of corporate accountability for human rights abuses, particularly in the financial sector, once we leave the comfort zone of human rights directly connected to a particular project. And here is where the state duty to protect comes in. It is very clear from the guiding principles, and of course, international law principles in general, that the state is responsible if it fails to prevent human rights abuses by failing to implement adequate regulations, policies, legislation, or adjudicatory measures. So here is the focus I wanted to also have on the financial regulators who are responsible for these aspects. Regulatory action by the state, I believe, is the key here to establish what should and should not be done in order to safeguard human rights. But it is not so easy either, because there are all these issues cannot be dodged. The issues I mentioned with regards to the companies, just because now we are talking about the regulatory action. But I can tell you one thing for sure: the way to achieve that objective is not to keep the regulators isolated from the human rights monitoring body, from the human rights standard setters, from the human rights experts. And this is unfortunately the situation that we have today. It is a situation where we don't see this degree of familiarity by financial regulators with the human rights framework, with its instruments, or even a fluid channel of dialogue and consultation with human rights actors like treaty monitoring bodies, national human rights commissions, experts, or civil society organizations. Much rather the opposite is the case. If you look at the body of financial reforms that emerged after the crisis, it is embodied in what some call this London-Pittsburgh architecture, right? Because the G20 in its 2 meetings of London and Pittsburgh in 2009 laid out what the roadmap of all those reforms was going to be. And it is a set of reforms that in design and in implementation by regulators is completely human rights blind. And I'll just mention 3 instances, if the time allows me.
2 minutes.
Okay. One is the rulemaking to address systemically important financial institutions. What is the issue here? That if you don't have a credible way to wind down a company that fails in a way that is orderly, that this is not going to disrupt vital banking services for the population, either because that company is too large or too interconnected, if you don't have that in place, it doesn't matter how many times you said in the law books that you are not going to bail out the company. The government is going to have to bail it out. It's going to have to use public finance for that. In the European Union, we know that already have 37.5% of GDP. That's the equivalent of the amount that has been committed by governments in the European Union to bail out their banks. So there's no wonder that we have all these austerity programs that are cutting services, that are cutting basic rights for many people, if you have to use all that money to bail out the financial sector. So there is a clear link to how that agenda plays out for financial, for human rights standard, for the enjoyment of human rights. Another issue, rulemaking to address bank capital requirements. The issue here is that bank capital requirements represent incentives for banks to lend for certain activities. So they determine the use of a policy tool by regulators, and like any policy tool by the government, it has to be pursued in a way that is accountable to the human rights framework. And yet the Basel III agreement, which is are the reforms of the framework of capital requirements as is known today, were done in isolation of any human rights input. So governments that attempt, for instance, to impose on their banks some human rights risk implementation requirement. There are, for example, proposals by organizations in Europe that have posited that as a possibility. Or, for instance, require banks to provide incentives for lending to certain purposes deemed more desirable from a human rights perspective, might clash with the Basel Agreement. It may or may not be possible within the Basel Agreement to implement or to use these tools for these purposes. I would posit that the conflict is only apparent because, in fact, the Basel Agreement is soft law and human rights treaties are hard law. So there should not be really a conflict. But many governments, I would say also, will feel compelled to still implement the Basel Agreement instead of their human rights commitments if they have to choose. Yeah, okay. So, and the final issue I wanted to raise is rulemaking to address over-the-counter derivative regulation. The issue here is that the distortions created in the market by the opacity and the speculative use of derivative instruments have exacerbated price rises in food. Note that I'm being very careful here. I'm not saying they have created the rises in food. I'm actually saying something that is what I think is very broad worldwide consensus today, that they have exacerbated, there's no question that they have exacerbated the prices, and this is enough to legitimate some human rights consideration when regulating those markets, because if we get it wrong, the rights of to food of millions of people will suffer as a result. But yet, this is another agenda that is being rolled out without any input from the human rights community. So those are some 3 examples that I wanted to give about role of regulators, an issue that I think we need to look at. I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good day, everybody. My mandate was to talk about practical implementation, and that's exactly what I will do today. Now, first of all, I would like to start off by saying that the business case for human rights is sustainability. I work for a bank, and we have been on the sustainability journey for more than 20 years now already. And we take sustainability very serious. Human rights forms part of sustainability. Now, the tone starts at the top. It starts with your strategy, first and foremostly. Our strategy is underpinned by values and ethics. And in ethical behavior and ethical conduct, human rights is included. So it comes part and parcel of our strategy. We have also decided that our people are really important to us. So we do not have a triple bottom line approach in our company, but rather a multiple bottom line approach. And the 4th pillar of the bottom line is then culture. Because like they say, charity starts at home. You first get it right at home, because if you have happy employees, you have productive employees, and they will make the profit for you. So charity really starts at home. We also have a theme in our company that we strongly capitalize on, and we say that there's no right way to do the wrong thing. It is also part of our strategy and our code of conduct and ethics that we will do the right thing regardless of the consequences. We are seen as the green and responsible bank, and that is indeed our competitive edge. We want to do the right thing. We want to be the most admired bank, not in terms of market share or making the most profit, but indeed by doing the right thing. And I can say to you that it has paid off very well for us. At this stage in time, our share price is at a record high. So the journey has really paid off. Do not expect results within a year or two. Expect results within 5 to 10 years after you start implementing. It's a long journey, but if you're on the sustainability journey, then you are on the right journey. We have all the necessary policies in place. In our country, as you know, we have a very progressive constitution and a very, very strict legislative framework that support the implementation of human rights in every aspect. And that is a huge advantage to us. We have a human rights statement. We developed this human rights statement after we did an extensive risk analysis. So the risk analysis informed the human rights statement. The human rights statement was distributed in the company very, very widely so that all employees could have input into it. We are now at the stage where we are going to make it public and going to invite public input on the human rights statement. Okay. Networking for us, I'm going to touch on a few points of very important things where you have to be involved in. Networking with institutions like the Global Compact, your local national business initiative, those type of things are so important for the exchange of ideas and best business practice and tools. In fact, for instance, an example, in my balanced scorecard, corporate social responsibility measures very highly. I am measured on how much I help the business industry to become a better place. So I assist companies to implement ethics and human rights frameworks, providing advice to them, providing tools to them. We are very transparent in this aspect, and I'm measured on it. Then where our clients are concerned, we believe in financial inclusion. We believe that all persons must have access to financial services at a reasonable cost. Again, in South Africa, we have codes that govern these things, like the Financial Services Sector Charter. We are currently working on treating customers fairly project as well, and there's a lot of these codes that support that. Then also where our clients are concerned, we are trying to create products, green and environmentally products for them, because if you look after the environment, then in actual fact you look after human rights, because you look after the people. And so we are very, very much focusing on innovation and creativity where products are concerned. We've also put in place a new investment product, which have done exceptionally well over the last 2 years. And this investment product funds research into alternative energy resources. So it's things like that. You have to walk the talk. You have to set the example as a financial services institution. Then we also have a helpline. We have an extensive grievance system in place. We also have an anonymous tip-off system in place for people who want to report violations from within the company and externally to the company. We have taken human rights out of human resources and put it into the ethics office so that it can be in an independent and objective area. It is also our ethics office that actually investigate human rights violations, and the ethics office report into the board. 2 different reporting lines. We have 2 board committees. The one focuses on corporate governance. Naturally, if you don't have proper governance in place in your company, then you're going to get nowhere. Just quickly on governance, your board of directors, we have a board ethics statement. Our board of directors have to recommit to it annually, and they are also measured on their commitment to that board ethics statement through board evaluations and 360 appraisals by their peers. And they know upfront that if they don't comply with the values in the board ethics statement, then we can and we will ask them to leave. Also, with regards to all the recent scandals that happened, we have a process in place where the board would request of us to do a gap analysis of these scandals that happened, come to a conclusion of why exactly it happened, and then the board want to know from us, we have to tell them why it will not happen in our company. What sort of controls do we have in place to prevent that sort of thing? Then we are also focused, again with our clients, again with sustainability, we focus on providing them with tools to support them in implementing a sustainability approach in their own companies. All these tools are free, and we also provide the support from our own staff. Community and environment, yes, we do project financing. We are the first bank to have implemented the Equator Principles in Africa, and we are still doing it. We do extensive social and environmental impact assessments before we provide finance to clients. And also where procurement are concerned, vendors, suppliers, as well as clients, I have what we call the good, bad, and ugly approach. You have your good clients and vendors and suppliers, and we will support them and they will support us. You will have the bad ones, which are a reputational risk. You steer clear of them. And then you have the ugly ones. Those are the ones whose hearts is in the right place, but they just don't do the right things. So for those vendors, suppliers, as well as for our clients in that regard, we will say to them, we are willing to finance you, or we are willing to support and assist you with tools, advice, support, all these things. But if you are to become a client of us, these are the requirements. If you are to become a vendor or a supplier of us, these are the specific requirements. Extensive assessments where business ethics as well as human rights are included, are done before they become part of our panel or part of our client base. We have a government partnership through the National Business Initiative where we try to influence policy. It's not always successful, but we try our best, and we believe that we have to do that. We are also a carbon neutral company, again showing our commitment to sustainability and to human rights, because by preventing carbon emissions, we are also looking after the environment, looking after people. Okay. Then due diligence. We have an extensive risk management and enterprise governance and compliance framework in place that we follow and are rated and measured according to. We have internal and external audits where human rights are concerned. We follow a human rights compliance assessment developed by AIM for Human Rights. That's part of the assessment. We couple that with an intensive integrated risk assessment that we have developed ourselves. And there's also a product assessment. We are currently busy with assessing all our products in terms of the guiding principles to see if they are human rights friendly. Where reporting is concerned, we have to report on human rights in our integrated report. We do a communication of progress every year. This year we have submitted an advanced communication of progress. We do board reporting. Our company is included in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which is quite difficult. We are also part of the Carbon Disclosure Project, which all goes to transparency. Transparency, very important. Transparency and sharing of information. I think that is one of our strengths, where we are really willing to share and engage with all stakeholders and our peers in the industry. And then just the last point, corporate social responsibility. Again, just focusing on other companies and entities that we assist. And we also assist them through our National Business Initiative, where we do certain projects, we develop tools, and we make those tools available to all the companies out there. And they are also available, and we are available for them to contact us for personal support. And we actually go out to their companies and assist them. And then just from a foundation point of view, because we are a banking institution, education is a very high priority for us. So we heavily invest in education in South Africa. That is our priority, not the golf challenge, I might add, if you know about the $1 million golf challenge in South Africa that we also sponsor. And what we are also currently just busy with is we are driving a project on behalf of the UNGC and the National Business Initiative for human rights in business in South Africa, and we are developing a framework for South African businesses to implement human rights. That's it.
Thank you very much, Truke. That's the first clap that I've heard in the whole, in mid session. That's great. Okay, Raoul, you've got a big shoes to fill now, my friend.
That's going to be much more difficult. Well, thanks, Chair. I would like to say a couple of words about the OECD guidelines and the human rights chapter in the OECD guidelines, and also how that relates to the financial sector. First of all, the OECD guidelines, they are the most comprehensive set of guidelines on corporate responsibility there is around. It's binding for governments. It's I chaired the negotiations on the guidelines, which took 2 years, and in 2011 it was adopted by 44 heads of state and ministers in Paris. It was chaired by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It's a form of soft law, but it's binding for governments. So that's quite unique. And another unique element of the OECD guidelines is that it has a grievance mechanism, and it's the only code of conduct around which has a grievance mechanism. And the grievance mechanism consists of national contact points who have a task to address complaints in specific instances from NGOs and trade unions against businesses. And they have a task to solve these problems. And if they don't solve it, then they make a statement. What is important is that during the negotiations we worked very intensely together with Professor Ruggie and his team to make sure we have a coherent human rights chapter in the OECD guidelines, because it would be really strange if the UN system would say left and if the OECD would say right. And we made sure it's consistent, and we worked very hard to have a coherent approach to that. Well, both Professor Ruggie and myself, we worked in parallel, but we both didn't have enough time to cover the financial sector. It was in the negotiations terms of reference, but we just didn't have the time to finish that. And it was a very important task, and we didn't make it on time. At that time there was also the start of the financial crisis, and what if there's one thing the financial crisis showed is that there's a huge demand for ethics in the financial sector, and the group in the OECD and also the other adherent governments like Brazil and Colombia and many other countries who are adhering to the government, they say, well, we need to work on that. It's very clear that the financial sector is covered by the OECD guidelines, so it's also covered by the NCP grievance mechanism. And actually the question is, we worked on supply chain responsibility. That was one of the most contentious issues. How do you explain what supply chain responsibility is? And the wording we used both in the Ruggie guidelines as well as the OECD guidelines is still developed on the basis of our thinking in, for example, textile companies, extractive industries, but it's not focused on the financial sector. Basically, there's the three-pronged approach. You have to avoid causing adverse impacts, you have to avoid contributing to adverse impacts, and even you have to seek ways to prevent adverse impacts from happening and try to mitigate them, even if you haven't contributed yourself. And that sounds great, but it's also a very difficult question to answer what it means for the financial sector. Then there's the element of due diligence, which comes from the financial sector in a complete different area, but we transposed the idea of due diligence to the corporate social responsibility realm, but it's a relatively new term. And it's developed for other kinds of businesses. So the question we face in the OECD and also beyond the OECD, because the UN working group is also on our team of the advisory group on this project, is basically, what does this all mean for the financial sector? This three-pronged approach on supply chain and due diligence, what does it mean? And that's still a quite serious question. It's urgent because we already know at that time that the NGOs and trade unions were going to test the financial sector in NCP cases. Well, and I'm not Nostradamus, but a couple of weeks ago there was another case. So there are now two cases against banks. One is pending at the Norwegian national contact point and at the Dutch national contact point, because their pension funds are involved in a case related to Korea and India. And another one is pending in the UK NCP, and that's related to three British banks doing business with a company in Russia. And what we need to do is try to, first of all, help businesses trying to answer the question, what does it all mean for us? And we also need to help the grievance mechanism, because they have never dealt with cases. It's not a banks and other financial institutions do not have a normal supply chain. They provide credit, or they provide loans, or they provide advisory services. Sometimes they provide insurance, and that's something else than a normal supply chain. Well, so what we have started is a mapping exercise, trying to focus on these questions. And this mapping exercise is doing actually two things. first of all, we try to find out what it all means, and then we look at the type of financial services we provide, the financial sector provides, what kind of leverage is involved, what's the type of financial services involved, and we look at all types of financial services and look at the question, what does it mean? So we look at equity, debt, transactions, insurance, everything the financial sector does. So we have included insurance, banks, pension funds, and all kinds of financial institutions are involved. We do it together with UNPRI, the UNEP, FI, also the Equator Principles banks are involved because they are doing a lot of good things. So apart from the question, what does it mean? We also address the question, are there good practices around? Well, so what I'm actually very happy to hear is what Nedbank is doing, because this is actually the type of work we are looking for, and we try to gather that on a more global scale and try to distill good practices out of that. So I think you deserve the applause, and I don't want an applause yet.
There's a member of the OECD sitting over there somewhere. Thanks very much. I do think it's very interesting that we've got this the sort of inadvertency that you ran out of time, both yourself and John, to pick up, and indeed you would have maybe needed years, but that Aldo makes the point that it is an exceptional, an extraordinary, and indeed you underline this, that perhaps it's a damn good thing, because, you know, to use a trite phrase, if the one size fits all would have been actually very inappropriate and indeed degrading and retrograde if we had put it into finance. So, you know, that's maybe something to reflect on as we get to questions and answers. But next, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and I love the energy in the assembly hall on the opening session yesterday. Today the energy may be a bit lower, but I guess it'll not in here, of course. I'll do three things. First, I'll present the fund which I'm working with and the Council on Ethics, and that's the background to say something about our experience with the guiding principles as they relate to our work. And then third, I'll make a proposal for advancing the guiding principles in the field of investment to strengthen the enforcement of the guiding principles. So first, I'll address the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global, which is the sovereign wealth fund, as David said. Current value of the fund is $670 billion. So it holds more than 1.2% of all listed shares in the world. So it's a large fund. That's where Norway puts its oil income, basically. The fund has an ethical mandate, which covers some products, like production of chemical and nuclear weapons and tobacco. Producers of such products, they are excluded from the fund. That's not so complicated, basically, since it's a product-oriented exclusion. But then the ethical mandate further covers some types of unethical conduct, and that's where we come into the human rights issues. It covers involvement by the companies in which we are invested, if they are involved with serious or systematic human rights violations, severe environmental damage, various violations of the rights of individuals in situations of war and conflict, gross corruption. Such conduct may also lead to exclusion from the fund. That means that the fund is banned from investing in such companies. And the exclusion mechanism works like this. The Council on Ethics, of which I'm currently the chair, supervises the conduct of companies in the portfolio, which is 8,000 companies, so it's a bit complex. But if it finds something serious, then we write a recommendation on exclusion to the Ministry of Finance. Suggest exclusion. The ministry decides on exclusion, or it decides formally to observe the conduct of the company, or it decides not to follow the recommendation at all. And the most well-known company that is excluded based on human rights violations is Walmart, which was excluded due to supply chain labor conditions. And the most well-known that was not excluded by the ministry, even though we recommended it, that's PetroChina. Our recommendations are being made public on our website after a decision has been made, so people can look it up, and there would be between 15 and 40 pages, so there's quite a large investigation into the conduct on the ground and analysis of the corporate structures, which is often very complicated. The Council researches the facts on the ground in which the company may be involved. And then we write the recommendation and we assess the conduct and the future risk of such unethical conduct. This whole exercise is forward-looking. This is where the UN guiding principles come in to play. So what we have done with respect to the guiding principles, we followed the process very closely, and we've now started to try to use them partly in our recommendations, which are currently being drafted. There are no public recommendations yet where we have tried to apply the principles. But of course we are applying our own mandate. That's the basis for what we do. But we try to support our own reasoning with other internationally accepted sets of norms to make them more legitimate. And the guiding principles is such a set, especially since they have been so widely accepted. And our recommendations are forward-looking. The fund shall not be complicit in human rights violations through its ownership of shares. And then the guiding principles, which are also basically forward-looking, they are especially pertinent. And one other experience should also be mentioned with relation to the guiding principles. We have attempted to use part of the guiding principles also related to environmental damage. That lies outside the scope of the principles. But we have found that at least parts of the due diligence approach is useful also in that field. So it could be expanded, at least elements of it. And it's not that surprising, since John Druggy also based his proposal on elements from environmental law and techniques as well as from financial law. So that sort of took up parts of that experience with relation to impact assessments. And there's also a third element in the development of the guidelines, the guiding principles related to the Norwegian fund, and that relates to the OECD guidelines. Because ownership rights in the fund, if you are not excluded, the fund could exercise ownership rights towards the company, and that's exercised by the fund manager, and the fund manager is the Central Bank of Norway. That exercise of ownership rights follows a separate mandate, and that mandate is based on, among other things, the UN Global Compact and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And since the guidelines, as we just heard, in 2011 now have included a new chapter on human rights based on the UN guiding principles, in that way the principles have become a foundation also for the exercise of ownership rights. But I'm not quite sure whether that's been taken up yet, but at least that's now sort of automatically come into the mandate because of the revision that we heard about. And my third point, that's the recommendation, forward-looking recommendation. This panel here is a panel on the role of the finance sector in advancing the guiding principles. And as we've heard, there's an exercise going on to analyze what the finance sector is, and it's very important at least to on the one hand you have the lenders, and on the other hand you have the investors, the shareholders, which is a very different part of the finance sector and which we represent. But what I want to do is to make one proposal to the working group or to the United Nations systems in that regard. Background is the following. Over the last 20 years or so, there's been a significant development in capitalism, no less. And I'm not talking about the financial crisis. Institutional investors, typically pension funds, have become much more important as shareholders. In many large companies, they are the dominant shareholders. That could make institutional shareholders important vehicles for change of corporate conduct. But very often they do not engage with the companies at all. They only care about the share price. Some institutional shareholders care. The most important set of guidelines with respect to the so-called responsible investment, that is the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, the so-called PRI or UN PRI. They were adopted in 2006. It is, I quote, an investor initiative in partnership with United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative and the UN Global Compact. So the United Nations been involved in the establishment of the principles. And the core of the PRI principles is the inclusion of what they call ESG, that is environment, social and governance issues, in the investment policies of the signatories. Human rights are not specifically included, and that's my point. They're only covered under the S for social. And we also heard about that yesterday on the panel on finance, how human rights very often are seen as political or put very low down on the priority since it's covered under the S. And that is a too low priority for human rights in today's world. So a real step forward in advancing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights would be to have them included in the principles for responsible investment. Responsible investors and the UN-backed initiative should include an expectation that companies follow the UN guiding principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That shows how lively this is. We're getting good claps all the time. Is anyone here from the UN PRI? No? Or anyone willing to admit it? But yeah, that's great. Oh, that's great. It's great to have that as a concrete proposal. May I, just before I ask Bennett to talk, just remind everyone to make a beeline for Madeleine up behind me if you want to ask a question, so please register. And finally, but not least, Bennett, thank you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here with a number of friends and colleagues in the room, and I hope new friends and colleagues to make down the road. I'm going to follow the immediate prior speaker by also making three basic points. I think ever since I read Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being in the 1980s, I've stuck to the rule of threes, if you recall that, for those with maybe a wry sense of humor. But my first point is going to be about the increasing focus of investors on human rights as a source of risk. My second point is going to be to emphasize the utility of the guiding principles as a risk assessment tool for investors. And my third and final point is to emphasize the natural alliance and growing cooperation between investors and NGOs in pressing companies to pay attention to human rights risk and to implement the guiding principles. So, point one. Look, most of us, I'm sure all of us, are here at this conference and we're working on business and human rights first and foremost because we care about human rights, whatever we do for a living. That certainly is what brought me to this field in the 1990s as a U.S. diplomat. And I'm delighted to be here as an investor on behalf of Calvert. And certainly Calvert was not alone among investors going back to the 1980s at coming to the human rights agenda from a moral perspective. And I'm delighted to be on the panel with the South African since it was the South Africa divestment movement that I think more than any other force really focused and mobilized investors around human rights 30 years ago, and Calvert was the first U.S. mutual fund company to decide not to invest in companies operating in then apartheid South Africa back beginning in 1982. So this is a moral agenda, and the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility and counterparts in Europe and elsewhere around the world have come to it as that. But what we've really seen more and more over the last decade or dozen years is the growing recognition both by social and faith-based investors and by mainstream investors and some of the largest institutional asset managers in the world, that this is also about risk. And that as much as we care about human rights as individuals, as investors, we've got to care about human rights as a source of risk. And this truth has been, I think best understood over the last dozen plus years in the context of the oil, gas, and mining industries, the disruptions that Shell and the others faced in the Niger Delta due to a whole confluence of human rights and governance and corruption and environmental issues, the disruption just a few months ago, well known to my friend Chris Jochnick at Oxfam, of Newmont Mining being shut down in Peru due to environmental and human rights protests by the local community. We could have a whole conference just, of course, on extractives and human rights. Also, in just recent months, we see examples that investors are getting involved in consumer electronics with Apple and Foxconn, and with internet companies over the last half dozen years, as more of us in the investment community, not just the human rights community, recognize that the future viability of internet service providers really relies on trust of users that freedom of expression and right to privacy is going to be respected. So we at Calvert join our traditional socially responsible and faith-based investors and mainstream investors in seeing material risk factors at work in industry after industry, in company after company that we look at. And we could spend all day just citing examples. Now, sometimes the materiality can't really be quantified. Sometimes it's less tangible. It might be potential operational risk. You can't always predict it. But we at Calvert now are joined by many others in factoring human rights risk into our day-to-day evaluation of risk across our portfolios. So I think that human rights, for this reason of materiality, is becoming more important to investors. I think the Sudan issue around Darfur half a dozen years ago, even less, the divestment movement there picked up and reinforced some of the focus that had first been established 3 decades ago around South Africa. So this is a mainstream risk issue. Second point, the guiding principles. Rolf mentioned appropriately the fact that both in the OECD process that you ran and in the guiding principles process that John Ruggie led, that due diligence became the operative phrase, and so appropriately taken from the investment world, because it's about defining a risk. And investors see the guiding principles as a template for assessing risk across their portfolios. The due diligence set of principles in particular lay out a template for us to use that we at Calvert, and I'm sure others, particularly those aligned with the PRI, are beginning to use as well as they look at different portfolios, different holdings in different industries. I'm delighted to mention that the Institute for Human Rights in Business will be publishing in this winter, launching this winter in London and New York, a report on, largely, not entirely focusing on the guiding principles, in effect a guide for investors as to how to use that due diligence framework in particular. And I'm delighted that we at Calvert and the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility have worked closely with the Institute in producing this report. The report also highlights other recent standards and initiatives of particular utility to investors. So I can tell you that on behalf of Calvert, and no doubt on behalf of many other investors around the world, that we are using the guiding principles to ask questions, sometimes tough questions, of companies in which we already invest or may consider investing, and we're just not going to have the confidence in a company management unless they are taking seriously human rights risk in virtually every industry. That degree of risk, of course, varies by market, by technology, by geography, but it's apparent in every industry to some extent. Third and final point, the natural alliance, the common interest between investors and NGOs. Sometimes strange bedfellows, no doubt, but I think appropriate fellow travelers. As we share many of the same values, but also the same sense of human rights risk. Now, NGOs appropriately have different motivations in many ways than investors. Those of us in the so-called socially responsible investment world combine the two worlds. But even for investors who don't take a particularly moral view of the world, who just take a hard-headed risk and return point of view, can also find a natural alliance with NGOs. And that doesn't mean agreeing on everything, working together on everything, but I am so heartened by the growing number of issues where I see direct cooperation based on a convergence of interests between NGOs and investors. Just a couple of very, very quick current examples. One is the multi-stakeholder coalition of apparel brands from around the world, trade unions, human rights NGOs, and investors working to persuade the government of Uzbekistan to stop forced labor in harvesting its annual cotton crop, and in working with the ILO to change the fundamental model of its industry. A second example is the cooperation among investors, NGOs, and some leading US-based multinationals in dealing with conflict minerals in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's been so encouraging to have not just the long-standing alliance between so-called SRIs and NGOs supporting Dodd-Frank 1502, but also to have large mainstream investors at the table with us, together with big multinationals like GE, AMD, Intel, HP, where we maybe don't agree on all the details, but we do agree on the fundamental objectives, in contrast to, say, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Another example is Burma, where investors have organized themselves in recent months, largely under the umbrella of the Conflict Risk Network, in joining forces with a number of human rights NGOs, but also with several like-minded large multinational corporations, including GE and Coca-Cola, in standing up for clear human rights guidelines as U.S. companies in particular, among others, go into Burma. And I'm just so delighted that investors came together in delivering a very specific set of comments to the U.S. State Department, asking for tougher, more specific reporting requirements for companies going into Burma. And we very much hope that the EU and other jurisdictions will have similar standards of specificity around human rights in Burma for companies going in there. So my final point here, it's still really the third and final point, but just to put a bow around it if I can for a moment, and that is I've had some concerns about the extent and pace of the uptake by companies across industries around the world of the guiding principles. I've been very, very impressed, as others have been, with some companies that have made very public commitments but have also done the hard work, or still doing the hard work behind the scenes to implement the guiding principles. But I've also been very concerned about the silence we've heard from so many companies. And I think that this natural alliance of interest between NGOs and investors, whether traditional responsible investors or big mainstream asset managers, can play an absolutely vital role here in pressing companies to implement the guiding principles. Most companies won't pick up the guiding principles, with all due respect, without some degree of persuasion, if not pressure. And investors, like NGOs, have real skin in the game. Sorry to use an American phrase that doesn't translate perfectly, but we have ownership of these companies, and we've got to care about that risk. So I look forward to working on these issues with all of you in a world where strange bedfellows are fellow travelers every day, and not just because we share the same values, but because we share the same interests. Thank you.